September 1944, Eastern France. American forces had completed the encirclement. The German garrison was trapped inside a fortress that had been built for war long before this one. Thick stone walls commanding high ground, narrow approaches covered by interlocking machine gun fire. Artillery positions were dug in. Underground chambers could absorb punishment. A well inside the fortress ensured water. This was not a temporary defensive position. It was meant to hold. Inside were approximately 1,500 German troops, commanded by a major who had already made up his mind. He had sworn, openly, publicly, that he would never surrender to the Americans. As Patton's Third Army sealed the perimeter, the situation was clear to everyone involved. The fortress was surrounded. No reinforcements were coming. The Americans had the guns, the air power, and the numbers to reduce it eventually. The only unanswered question was how much blood would be spilled first. As was Patton's habit, he tried diplomacy before destruction, not out of sentimentality, but efficiency. An American officer approached the fortress under a white flag. His message was simple, direct, and entirely by the book. Surrender now. Avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Your men will be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. They will survive the war. The response came back quickly, and it was not subtle. The German major rejected the offer with absolute conviction. No hesitation, no request for negotiation, no conditions. Tell General Patton, he said, that if he wants this fortress, he'll have to kill me to get it. It was meant to sound heroic, unbreakable. The kind of defiant declaration that history books romanticize. Patton's reply was just 4 words. I can arrange that. What followed was not a siege. It was not a prolonged battle. It was a systematic destruction that lasted less than 12 hours and proved that Patton took people at their word. The German position was not some improvised strong point thrown together in panic. It was a true fortress, one of many stone fortifications scattered across eastern France, remnants of older wars that had never entirely lost their military value. Thick masonry walls rose several meters high. The ground around it fell away sharply, giving defenders clear fields of fire in every direction. Narrow access routes funneled attackers into predictable killing zones. Inside the walls, the Germans had everything they needed to resist for a long time. They had artillery pieces positioned to cover the approaches, machine guns overlapping every likely avenue of attack, underground chambers capable of withstanding sustained shelling, and critically, a reliable water source inside the fortress itself. The garrison numbered around 1,500 men. They were not elite troops, but they were not helpless either. The force was a mixture of worn infantry units, artillery crews, and officers from various formations that had fallen back into the fortress as American forces advanced. On paper, it was a formidable position. A frontal assault would be costly. A traditional siege could take weeks. There was another option. Patton could have bypassed the fortress. Many commanders would have. Leave a screening force behind, isolate the position, and continue the advance. That approach would have avoided immediate casualties and preserved momentum. But this fortress sat astride a key road junction. As long as it remained in German hands, American supply convoys would be forced onto longer, less efficient routes. Fuel, ammunition, and food would take more time to reach the front. The fortress was not just a military nuisance, it was a logistical threat. Patton understood logistics better than most generals. An advancing army lives or dies on supply lines. Leaving a hostile fortress on a critical route was not an option. And Patton had a guiding principle that rarely changed. Always offer surrender first. Not out of mercy, though he was not needlessly cruel, but out of efficiency. A surrendered enemy costs no American lives and no time. A fought-over position costs both. So Patton's ultimatum was standard, almost routine. Surrender. You will be treated correctly. You will go to a prisoner of war camp. You will live. The German major didn't just say no. He personalized the refusal. He invoked honor. He invoked duty. He invoked his oath never to surrender. And then he challenged Patton directly. If you want this fortress, he said, you'll have to kill me to get it. Other commanders might have seen this as a negotiating posture, They might have offered revised terms. They might have tried to persuade the major that surrender was not dishonorable given the circumstances. Patton saw none of that. To him, the major had made his position perfectly clear. He did not want terms. He did not want compromise. He wanted death over surrender. Patton was simply going to grant that request, efficiently and overwhelmingly. When the messenger returned with the German major's response, Patton's staff expected something different. Frustration, perhaps, anger, a dramatic outburst. That wasn't what happened. According to officers present, Patton's reaction was almost disturbingly calm. He listened to the report, absorbed the words, and responded with a tone that was neither emotional nor theatrical. "The major says we have to kill him," he said. "Let's not disappoint him." There was no rage in his voice, no satisfaction, just cold professional resolve. And then Patton began issuing orders. Not impulsive commands, but precise instructions, carefully sequenced and designed to accomplish exactly what the German major had challenged him to do, while minimizing American casualties and time. The first order was total encirclement, not a loose cordon. Not just blocking the main roads. Patton wanted the fortress completely sealed. No movement in, no movement out. If it could be done, the water supply would be cut. The fortress was strong, but the men inside still depended on supplies, communication, and the hope of relief. They would get none of those. The second order was artillery concentration. Every heavy artillery piece within range was instructed to register on the fortress. This was not going to be a random bombardment. Patton demanded precision. Stone walls could stop small arms. They could even resist light artillery. They would not resist 155mm shells. Underground chambers might protect against shrapnel, but repeated direct hits would collapse them. Patton wanted the fortress dismantled methodically, not battered indiscriminately. The third order was air support, not area bombing, not symbolic strikes. Patton called for tank-busting aircraft equipped with precision munitions. Specific targets were assigned: artillery positions, ammunition storage areas, and most importantly, the major's command post. This was not just about destroying defenses. It was about destroying control. And then came the order that revealed Patton's understanding of psychological warfare. He ordered loudspeakers brought forward. The Germans inside the fortress would not just be attacked, they would be informed. Not threatened, not taunted, informed. They would be told exactly what was coming and when. At this hour, artillery bombardment. At this hour, airstrikes. At this hour, ground assault. Patton wanted the men inside to have time. Time to think. Time to doubt. Time to realize that their commander's dramatic defiance was going to get them killed. Finally, Patton made his expectations clear to his own commanders. This was not going to be a cautious, casualty-averse operation. The German major had chosen a fight. Patton intended to deliver one so overwhelming, so precisely coordinated, that it would end quickly. Hours, not days. The message to American troops was equally clear. The enemy had been offered surrender. They had refused. What followed was the consequence of that decision, not American cruelty. The assault would begin at dawn, not because dawn attacks were traditional, but because Patton wanted the Germans to spend the entire night knowing exactly what was coming. The night before the assault was not quiet. It was worse than that. It was predictable. As darkness settled over the fortress, American units completed the encirclement. Artillery batteries rolled into position. Aircraft were briefed. Infantry and engineers prepared their equipment with methodical calm. And then the loudspeakers came to life. Not with threats, not with insults, with information. In clear German, the voice explained exactly what would happen and when. At first light, artillery bombardment would begin. After that, airstrikes would target specific positions. Then ground forces would assault through the breaches. The message was repeated again and again. Surrender was still possible. Anyone who walked out with hands raised would be treated as a prisoner of war. Medical care would be provided. Those who stayed would face the consequences. Inside the fortress, the effect was devastating. The German soldiers were not ignorant of their situation. They knew they were surrounded. They knew American firepower was overwhelming. but now they were being forced to count the hours. Every minute of the night dragged on. Some men lay awake staring at stone ceilings, imagining the first shell. Others whispered among themselves, questioning whether their commander's oath was worth their lives. Junior officers argued quietly, weighing duty against survival. The major tried to maintain discipline. He repeated his orders. He invoked honor. He reminded his men of their duty. But discipline frays when certainty replaces hope. This was no longer a question of if the Americans would attack. It was a question of when. By the early hours of the morning, cracks were already forming. Some soldiers had decided that when the moment came, they would surrender, orders or not. Others feared that even attempting to surrender would get them shot by their own commander. Patton understood this dynamic perfectly. He knew that fear works best when it is structured. Chaos terrifies, but uncertainty paralyzes. A schedule, clearly announced, leaves nowhere to hide. When the sun finally began to rise, the men inside the fortress were already exhausted, and exactly on time, the first artillery guns opened fire. At first light, the waiting ended. Exactly on schedule, American artillery opened fire. This was not random shelling meant to intimidate. It was deliberate, calculated destruction. Heavy guns fired in coordinated patterns, concentrating round after round on the same sections of stone wall. The fortress had been built to resist medieval siege weapons and light artillery, not modern, high-explosive shells. Stone cracked. Masonry collapsed. Defensive positions that had stood for centuries began to fail within minutes. Inside the fortress, German artillery crews tried to respond. They fired a few defiant rounds toward American lines, and immediately paid for it. American counter-battery fire was precise and ruthless. The moment a German gun fired, shells began landing on its position. Crews quickly learned the lesson. Firing back meant death. One by one, German artillery pieces fell silent, not from lack of courage, but because survival demanded it. For 2 hours, the artillery never let up. Each barrage widened breaches. Each impact exposed more of the interior. Underground chambers collapsed as direct hits crushed ceilings and buried men alive. Then the next phase began. American P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead. These were not carpet bombing runs. They were precision strikes. Pilots attacked pre-identified targets, ammunition storage areas, command facilities, remaining artillery positions. 500-pound bombs slammed into the fortress, triggering secondary explosions that shook the entire structure. The German major's command post took multiple direct hits. With it went communication, coordination, and authority. Through all of this, the loudspeakers kept broadcasting. They described what was happening. They announced what would come next. They repeated the offer of surrender. And now something changed. Small groups of German soldiers began to emerge. At first, just a few, hands raised, faces gray with exhaustion and fear. Then more, dozens. They slipped out through damaged sections of wall, choosing life over loyalty to a commander who had promised them death. The major tried to stop it. He ordered men shot for attempting to surrender. He labeled them traitors, but that only accelerated the collapse. The soldiers inside realized they were trapped, not just by American firepower, but by their own commander's fanaticism. Morale disintegrated faster than the stone walls around them. By mid-morning, the fortress was already broken. Walls were breached in multiple places. Artillery positions were destroyed. The command structure had been shattered by precision strikes, and now Patton unleashed the final phase. American infantry attacked from every breach at once. Not a single heroic charge, but a synchronized advance. Sherman tanks rolled up to point-blank range and fired directly into openings. Engineers placed explosives on remaining strong points. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers that still resisted, and yet something remarkable happened. This was not the chaotic, bloody urban combat fortress assaults usually became. It was methodical. There was little left to fight. German resistance came in isolated bursts, small groups firing briefly, then surrendering. Without a functioning command structure, without artillery support, without hope, the fight drained away. American troops moved section by section, loudspeakers following them, broadcasting surrender appeals in German. The message was clear. Continued resistance was suicide, not heroism. By late morning, the fortress was no longer a fortress. It was a shattered shell. American forces had broken through every meaningful defensive position. The walls that had once symbolized permanence were now open wounds. Smoke drifted through courtyards. Ammunition fires burned themselves out. Resistance had collapsed into scattered, leaderless pockets. Most German soldiers no longer wanted to fight. They wanted out. Small groups surrendered wherever American troops appeared. Some dropped weapons immediately. Others emerged cautiously, hands raised, eyes searching for any sign that the promises broadcast through loudspeakers were real. They were. Prisoners were secured, searched, and moved to the rear. Wounded Germans received medical attention alongside American casualties. The system worked exactly as Patton intended. Fight ruthlessly, then stop the moment resistance ended. But one part of the fortress was still active. Deep inside what remained of the command bunker, the German major had barricaded himself with a handful of loyal troops. While the rest of the garrison collapsed, he clung to his original vow. He had said he would never surrender. He intended to keep that promise. When American infantry breached the bunker, the encounter was brief. The major reportedly raised his pistol. There was no speech, no final declaration, no theatrical last stand. An American sergeant fired. The German major was killed instantly, exactly as he had demanded. The soldiers still with him surrendered immediately. Whatever loyalty had kept them fighting vanished the moment their commander was gone. They had followed orders to the end, but they had no interest in dying for a vow that had already proven pointless. The entire operation, from the first artillery shell at dawn to the final surrender, had taken less than 12 hours. American casualties were minimal. A handful of wounded, no American dead. German losses were severe. The major was dead as promised. Roughly 200 German soldiers killed, mostly during the bombardment and final assault. Around 300 wounded, and nearly 1,000 taken prisoner. A fortress that could have resisted for weeks fell in half a day. When the fighting stopped, Patton did not celebrate. There was no victory speech, no dramatic declaration, no visible satisfaction. The fortress had fallen exactly as he had planned. To Patton, that made it a completed task, not a moment for emotion. Later that day, he toured the ruins. According to officers who accompanied him, Patton was calm, almost clinical. He walked through shattered walls and collapsed bunkers, listening to brief reports, asking short, practical questions. When someone mentioned the German major, Patton responded with characteristic bluntness. He said we'd have to kill him. We did. There was no mockery in the statement, just cause and effect. But Patton made a point of doing something else during that tour, something many people missed. He visited the wounded German prisoners. He ensured they were receiving proper medical treatment. American medics were ordered to care for German wounded side by side with American casualties. This wasn't a contradiction in Patton's mind. It was a principle. Be ruthless only while resistance continues. Be professional once it ends. Patton believed the line between those two states should never be blurred. Word of the fortress spread quickly. Among American troops, it reinforced what they already knew about George S. Patton. He would always offer surrender first, not because he hesitated to fight, but because efficiency mattered. If the enemy refused, he would use overwhelming force without apology and end the matter quickly. Among German forces, the story had a darker effect. Fortresses fell all the time. That wasn't unusual. What frightened German commanders was how this one fell. 12 hours, no negotiation games, no drawn-out siege, no second chances after defiance. Patton had taken the major's challenge literally and fulfilled it with methodical precision. German officers began circulating the story as a warning. When American forces, especially Third Army units, offered surrender terms, those offers were not bluffs. They were statements of fact. Several German officers later admitted during interrogations that they surrendered specifically because they had heard about the fortress. They understood that refusing terms didn't lead to better offers. It led to exactly what Patton promised. This predictability was terrifying. Not random brutality, not emotional retaliation, but certainty. You knew what would happen if you resisted. You knew what would happen if you surrendered, and the choice and the consequences were entirely yours. Looking back at the fortress battle, it's worth asking what the German major's defiance actually accomplished. He believed he was making a stand for honor. He believed refusal would inspire his men. He believed his willingness to die would force the Americans to hesitate, or at least to pay a heavy price. None of that happened. Instead, his decision produced a stark and measurable outcome. About 200 of his men were killed. Another 300 were wounded, many permanently. Nearly 1,000 were taken prisoner. The fortress itself, supposedly a strong position, held for less than 12 hours. The road junction was in American hands by nightfall. Patton's advance was delayed by, at most, half a day. Had the major accepted the initial surrender offer, every one of those 1,500 men would have survived. They would have spent the remainder of the war in prisoner of war camps, harsh but far safer than the battlefield. Many would have returned home after the war ended. Instead, hundreds died or were maimed. And for what? The fortress fell anyway. The advance continued anyway. Nothing meaningful changed. This is the brutal arithmetic of war that some idealistic commanders refuse to accept. Heroic last stands make powerful stories, but they rarely alter outcomes when faced with overwhelming force. What they do change is the casualty count. The major believed his defiance would matter. Patton showed him that it didn't. And there is a broader leadership lesson buried here, one that extends beyond the battlefield. When someone makes a dramatic declaration, "You'll have to kill me. I'll never surrender. Over my dead body." They are betting that the other side will treat those words as rhetoric. Patton didn't. He treated them as a statement of preference. You want death rather than surrender? Very well, that can be arranged. The major learned that lesson too late. His men learned it at the cost of their lives or their freedom. Other German commanders learned it in time and chose surrender when offered terms. The fortress fell in September 1944. The German major died there, exactly as he promised. His name is largely forgotten. The precise location of the fortress hardly matters now. What matters is the lesson. With Patton, dramatic defiance didn't prolong negotiations. It didn't force compromise. It didn't earn respect. It only changed the intensity of what came next. The German major believed his defiance would force hesitation. He believed that by saying, "You'll have to kill me," he was drawing a moral line, one the Americans might pause before crossing. Perhaps they would negotiate longer. Perhaps they would soften their terms. Perhaps they would try harder to avoid bloodshed. That assumption was his final mistake. Patton did not hear defiance as courage. He did not hear it as honor. He heard it as clarity. The major had defined the conditions under which he would stop fighting. Patton simply accepted those conditions and acted accordingly. No anger, no drama, no revenge. Just execution. There is something deeply unsettling about that kind of leadership. It leaves no room for romanticism, no space for heroic narratives. It reduces war to cause and effect. You were offered surrender. You refused. This is what follows. Some people argue Patton should have tried harder to persuade the major, that he should have shown more patience toward a man essentially committing suicide by command. Others argue the opposite, that Patton respected the major's agency by taking him at his word and not wasting time or lives on futile persuasion. There is no easy answer. What is undeniable is the result. The fortress fell in less than 12 hours. American casualties were minimal. German losses were devastating and unnecessary, and every other German commander who heard the story learned something crucial. With Patton, threats were not bargaining tools. They were permissions. If you dared him to destroy you, he would. Not emotionally, not excessively, but completely. That predictability became one of his most powerful weapons. It shaped decisions before battles even began. It saved American lives while forcing enemies to confront the consequences of their own words. The German major wanted a heroic death. He got one, quick, unceremonious, and forgotten. His men paid the real price. And that is the quiet, uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. In war, dramatic defiance rarely changes outcomes. It only decides how much suffering comes before the inevitable. So the question remains for you. Was Patton right to take the major at his word? Or should leaders always try one more time to save lives, even when someone has clearly chosen death? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories about leadership, responsibility, and the real consequences of bold words, subscribe. Because in war and in life, what you say matters.